All right, boys, welcome back. As promised, we are here on the foreign policy beat talking about kind of the biggest story in the world right now, which is, I guess I'm sad to say, Ukraine, Russia, Vladimir Putin, Volodymyr Zelensky. Joining us in the lab is our Jim. I'm going to call you an expert. I know you're a lot more. I see your bylines pretty often in The Hill. I've seen them in other places. You're sort of a well-known defense and foreign policy writer around Washington, D.C. I know you've done a lot more in your career as well. Welcome to Star Spangled Gamblers. Would you like to say hello? I don't know if I did a good job introducing you.
Well, hello, gamblers.
They sing folk songs back to you. Hello, Jim. Pratik, I guess I should say hello to you too. I was thinking maybe I could just read a quote of yours about the gravity of the situation in Ukraine right now, and then maybe we could break out into a couple of our would you rather type questions. We like to make our guests agonize over stupid questions and maybe come up with smart things to say on the back of that. Does that sound okay with you?
Good.
All right. So, Jim, you recently wrote that, quote, Russia may elect to change the phase of war once again. Last time, it was a hybrid war. This time, Putin, can employ a wide variety of means which so far it has eschewed, including significant missile strikes on populated areas, chemical weapons on logistics and supply lines, or low-yield nuclear weapons against strategic targets in Ukraine. So, can we maybe just put a little lantern on that for a second? Are you one of those guys who thinks there's going to be a nuclear war in Ukraine soon?
Well, I think it's certainly possible. Certainly don't want it to happen. It's just a matter of, what's the decision, or what's Putin's decision-making process going to drive him to do? He probably feels he's been backed into a corner, that he's kind of backed himself into it in a way. But his way of thinking, where there were opportunities to negotiate in December of last year when he made the NATO proposals to the U.S. and the NATO. And then in April of this year, we've heard reports, quite a few of them, that Ukraine and Russia reached an agreement, but Boris Johnson went over and scuppered that. So, and then there's a report this morning that he was talking to President Erdogan of Turkey and said, well, there's always the possibility for negotiations. So he probably feels he's made quite a few offers on the back of warnings for about the last 10 years that you guys shouldn't be expanding NATO to our border. So at some point, he may feel he just has no choice.
So is this like the game of him going out and saying conciliatory things about his ex-wife, hoping that she'll call him back or something like that? Or how real is this?
Well, I think she knows better than to do that. But I think it's probably, from his point of view, he's looking at this as a traditional Russian leader, and it's that the path for Ukraine has been a path of invasion for a long, long time. And even if he wasn't Vladimir Putin, ex-KGB guy, he might still be thinking the same way, just looking at the map of how Russia's been invaded, which I think has been 7 times from the West.
Right.
So he's, partly it may just be due to the personalities in play, Biden, Trump, Putin, but also just, looking at the map, and Russians have always had, looking at it, a well-grounded fear in invasion from the West. And although we'd like to say, well, that kind of thing, as John Kerry said, that kind of thing doesn't happen in the 21st century. It's like, well, yes, apparently it still does, because it did. Right. So I think any Russian leader would probably think the same way.
Right.
Just looking at the map.
Right. Right. So the only so basically you're saying that Ukraine is the soft underbelly of the Russian Empire, and he would be the last in a long line of Russian rulers to get really triggered over what happens in that region. So do not underestimate him, which brings us to the present. Pratik, so we've done some prologue. Should we break into the would you rather, or do you want to get some more stuff on record first? I guess we have any. You want to take it?
I guess I would just ask a big picture question before we dive into specifics. I mean, it sounds like what you're saying is, on the one hand, Putin would be willing potentially to resort to quite drastic means, namely a nuclear weapon. On the other hand, that he may be open to dialogue. I mean, what do you think at a high level would be an outcome and an end game here that would be acceptable to Putin?
Well, probably that we freeze the situation on the ground because they've had the referendum in the 4 disputed areas. So as far as Russia's concerned, that's now sovereign territory plus Crimea. So at this point, they're probably willing to say, okay, let's call a ceasefire and halt the situation on the ground, and we'll redraw the borders and all will be good. That, of course, wouldn't be acceptable to the U.S. government or the U.S. political class. And also, it may not be acceptable to Ukraine. Even if Washington says we got a deal, will Ukraine go along with it? And to some point, we have to realize who's really driving this train. Is it Ukraine or Washington? And if Washington says we like those terms, what if Zelensky says I don't? Then what was Washington going to have to say? Well, we're going to cut off your weapons, pull out all the military advisors and the CIA guys that are there. Then what? Then of course, there'll be a cry from a lot of probably congressmen and senators and from editorial writers in the U.S. that we're abandoning Ukraine just like we abandoned the Hungarians in 1955 or 56. When in fact we didn't abandon them, we just never went in. But it's going to be that sort of, we're backsliding on democracy, we're handing the Ukrainians over to the Russians, when in fact we may have got ourselves in a position where we're the client and Ukraine's the patron now, and we may not be able to call quits when we want to.
Sounds like we need a Yalta conference.
No, we need the kind of politicians we had at the Yalta conference.
Got it. Politicians who don't let editorial writers on Twitter tell them what to do. Maybe that type.
Well, yeah, exactly. Back in the days, the Telegraph, I guess. That's what we had then.
Yeah. Powerful social media tool now, the Telegraph app. Well, okay. So let me ask. So we like to play Would You Rather. This is just like the high school game, lunch cafeteria taunting, where maybe we'll give you a couple equivalent outcomes that might be absurd, or they both might be really good, and then we'll just make you pick which one you think is more true. So do I have your consent to ask you stupid questions?
Go ahead.
All right. So
I used to work for the U.S. government, so it's happened to me before.
No limit to the dumb questions. Those letterhead from the Capitol Hill. Please answer the following 37 questions about the such and such program. All right. So the big news in the last couple of weeks was that Putin, first quietly and then not so quietly, ordered a partial mobilization of the Russian military. The number that's being bandied around is 300,000 men being put back into uniform, rearmed, and sent to do war stuff. So I guess I would ask, would you rather say that this mobilization, these 300,000 men, will have an immediate bearing on this war, or that they won't have really much bearing at all on the war?
Well, it depends what you mean by immediate. I mean, they have to be equipped, probably given a little refresher training. That'll take a couple of weeks. Then they've got to be deployed to the front. So in about a month, perhaps. I mean, I can't imagine they'd be rushing them to the, directly to the front. That's kind of what Stalin did in 1941. They just pushed people to the front because they were certainly in a desperate situation. I don't know if Putin feels he's in the same desperate situation today that the Soviet Union was in 1941. So I think it's going to take a couple of weeks. I mean, it'll have political effect immediately, obviously. But in terms of actually getting boots on the ground, I mean, literally, it's probably going to be a couple of weeks.
Got it.
But it may stiffen spines in Ukraine, though, if they feel there's an extra 300,000 Russians coming.
Yeah.
There's I suppose there are two markets here we're looking at, which may be related to this mobilization question. So one is, will Russia close its borders by October 1st? I mean, I'm seeing anecdotally on Twitter, there's just kind of a mad dash to leave Russia. I think Doug Campbell tweeted, air flights out of Russia are going for like more than $5,000 or something right now. So do you think Russia may close the borders in the next few days, or is that a bit of a stretch?
Yeah.
Well, first, I think if they were going to, it's probably too late if they haven't done it already. Everybody that wanted to get out of there and had $5,000 to spare is probably gone. And secondly, it would probably look, well, Ukraine did the same thing, I believe. They shut their borders and drafted everybody under 65 years of age. So it would pretty much look like they were doing the same thing Ukraine did. And the Russians may want to be able to say, well, we didn't have to resort to those types of extreme measures because enough Russian patriots turned up to, answer the mobilization call. So it may be better actually if they don't do, at least in terms of the optics.
And then the other question here, this is also on Insight Prediction, which is, will Russia formally declare war on Ukraine? You can tell me if I'm understanding this question, but I think the idea here is that basically when you look at Russian incursions into Ukraine, not only this time around, but also in 2014, I guess they've, technically avoided that designation to, make it seem, or, like to essentially say that this is a liberation, that it's being done, through other means. I mean, what is like the spirit of the question here, and then will it escalate to a formal declaration of war?
I think by not declaring a war, they in effect say they're, this is kind of somebody used the expression, ingathering of the Russian people. It's not, you declare war against a foreign enemy, whereas what they're really doing is recovering, I guess you'd think, lost Russian lands. So I don't know if they're in any better position legally or politically by declaring a war. They've already, the U.S. hasn't declared a war since 1945. And so that hasn't stopped anybody from going to war. So I'm not sure what Russia gains politically, other than perhaps some Geneva Convention protections for captives. There may be something there, but certainly not in terms of how it's conducted itself on the battlefield or politically.
I was just thinking maybe, obviously Russia is an authoritarian state and all that, but they do have some semblance of rule of law and constitutions. Would there be a reason to declare war to enhance Putin's power within Russian society, or that's not the case?
Well, I think it's probably too late. I guess the Duma can, meet and declare war, but I don't see what advantage it's going to cause. And all it would do would, you see a lot of commentators, mostly on Twitter or on the late night TV, saying, well, of course they would do that. He controls the Duma. They have no choice but to declare war if he asks it. And, he may not want to do it because he may know there's going to be a little too much debate in public that he may not want to endure. So, or there may be conditions attached by the Duma to the declaration of war that any executive would just as soon not have to deal with, whether it's an American executive or a Russian executive. So it may just be something at this point. It's what's to be gained by doing it. They're already at war. So, they're basically at war with NATO. So, what's to be gained by doing it? Other than, as I said, possibly something in line of Geneva protections or Geneva Convention protections for troops or something like that.
Always a high priority for Russian rulers, those Geneva protections. Let me ask one more question, and then we'll kind of go to some more bettable questions. So are you a big TikTok guy, Jim? You ever on TikTok?
No. I've seen TikTok videos, but I'm not on TikTok.
Okay. More of a Facebook guy.
I'm not the TikTok demographic.
Okay, so I'm a big TikTok guy, and that means I'm a big expert on just about everything. Like the people who were experts on the pandemic are now, and then they were experts on interest rates. Well, now they're actually experts on this war. So I'm very in the know because I follow these people who seem to know about everything. But what these experts keep telling me is that the 300,000 Russian troops aren't that big of a deal because Russia still doesn't have like trucks to take them food or ammunition and stuff. So basically, like, what the hell is the point of drafting a new army when you still can't feed it or something like that? Now, you've told me you're not a TikTok expert, but you are a real expert. So what do you think of that?
Well, I don't know how anybody would know how many trucks Russia has, or how they're going to or not get them, how they will get them to the front and sustain them once they're there. Defense Intelligence Agency probably does pretty good order of battle type analysis, and they may have an idea, but if they do, it'll probably be announced, as through some government channel, the head of DIA, maybe the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, the president, Secretary of Defense, somebody will get up there and say Russia can't do it. But I kind of doubt TikTok is going to be the way the U.S. government makes that analysis available to the world and the American public.
Interesting. So going on Google Maps and like counting dots around an air base is probably not reliable military intelligence.
Well, if it's recently updated, I suppose it may be.
Right. That's
right.
But
how do we know how many trucks the Russian military has?
Right.
And,
right,
the U.S. basically it makes use of commercial transportation through its contracts with the U.S. Transportation Command. I'm sure Russia probably has a similar fallback.
right, right. Requisition some civilian vehicles or something. All right. Well, Pratik, do I have your permission to move on?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So, let's see. Okay. So, two of the big questions for people who bet on this stuff center around Kherson, which now, like Anderson Cooper says, like Kherson or something like that. I don't speak Ukrainian, so I'm not going to pretend I can. Kherson in the south, and also the question of whether or not Russia will formally, from a constitutional perspective, annex conquered territories anytime soon. So I guess with that as prologue, would you rather say, if you were a betting man, Jim, that Kherson will be occupied by the Ukrainians once again by the end of October, so give it about a month, or that Russia will formally annex some of these territories that you can update us on the process of the referendums or whatever, but that, again, repeating the question, 25% chance is what betting markets are giving Kherson being back in Ukrainian hands in the next month. 35% chance are the odds that betting markets are giving that Russia will actually formally annex these conquered one of these conquered territories by October 1st. So in the next week.
I think they'll likely formally annex the territories because they've gone to the trouble of holding the referendums.
Yeah.
So they may as well make it legal as, by in effect formally annexing the territories. Probably making it legal is probably the wrong expression, but take the final step by formally annexing the territories.
Yeah. So, but like, can you do that quickly in Russia? One of the things that I have trouble with as a Westerner is like, even crooked regimes see like they have norms that they follow. Like, can Putin just wake up in the morning?
Well, I think they've had the vote, so now it's probably just a matter of drafting up a declaration for the Duma and Federation Council to vote on. And I'm not sure how Russia would formally, how any nation like that would formally go about annexing a territory, whether there's a final legal step they need to do internally, but certainly to like put the cherry on top, it would probably be good to have the Duma, the representatives of the Russian people welcome these new Russian people back into the fold. That would probably be a way to formalize the referendums, and certainly to make a welcome statement to the four provinces or the four areas.
The way this market would resolve is based on the Russian constitution, I think, being changed. So I know nothing about this, but apparently the constitution of Russia lists all the subjects, quote, subjects of the Russian Federation. So I think this would resolve if new new federal subjects, I guess, are recognized under the Russian constitution.
I mean, it sounds like there's at least a party to plan from what you said, Jim. It's not something they do in the dead of the night. They'd march some tanks and ballistic missiles across Red Square and welcome them or something.
No, I mean, you just have a vote,
Yeah.
a vote of the Duma, and just announce that, we recognize the accession of these areas to the Russian Federation and something like that. And then there may be some provision in the Constitution to increase the size of the territory or welcome and new parties to the Russian Federation. So they'll probably want to do that just to put the final legal gloss on it.
Pratik, this might be a good DGen pick. What do you think?
It sounds like there would be a process. I mean, we're looking at 5 days. It's an October 1st deadline. I don't know. I'm not sure.
Yeah, betting on like legal processes and authoritarian regimes is like, that's like one of my rules. Just don't do it.
Well, actually, they rely on them more than any other regime.
Interesting.
I mean, why do they always have elections? Why does Syria have elections?
Right.
What's that old thing? It's the homage vice pays to virtue. And the same thing, Russia, they have elections. North Korea has elections. So I think they may be extra attentive to that type of process than, say, the United States or the UK may be, just because they want to be able to say, we do that. How can you say we're not democratic? We have elections.
Yeah, propaganda is a bitch, Putin.
Mm-hmm. They can tweet the debate.
So does your perspective that an annexation in the near future, maybe not in the next week, but in the near future, is pretty likely? We're glossing over the question of Kherson, which was presumed to be the military jewel that Ukraine wanted to reconquer. Are you in the camp of people who thinks that the military operation in the south to retake Kherson was a feint, aka like army talk for just faking it so that the main attack could come somewhere else?
That I don't know. I would think, Ukraine obviously wants to retake it to say they've recovered, Ukrainian lands from the aggressor.
Yeah.
But then would that give the Russians, by then, if the Russians at that point say it's Russian territory, that gives them the excuse to then escalate if they wish to.
Right.
Which I always thought was the reason for, incorporating these four parts. It certainly moves the battle line forward. So any gains by Ukraine can then be characterized by Russia as an invasion of Russian territory, which then gives them the opportunity to make other moves to escalate potentially.
Also, according to TikTok, where the great experts in foreign policy are, according to TikTok, Russian reservists can only be deployed inside of Russia's borders. So you can fight a frontline war once you annex it. So
once you move the front,
right. Clever.
Yeah. So, and that would certainly give the Russian leadership to say, well, we're not sending our boys overseas. They're deployed within Russian territory. That may not do much for the mothers of the Russian young men that are being deployed, but, at least there's a talking point for Russia that unlike America, we don't send troops all over the world, et cetera, et cetera. We're just using them to defend our own territory.
Right. Makes sense to me. Well, so along those lines, there's two long shot bets. I think one of them we'd love to see hit. The other one would be really bad if it came to pass. So you mentioned that you thought that annexation was a sort of backdoor way for Putin to escalate the war, and we certainly hope that's not the case. But anyway, manifold markets, which is going to be new to a lot of our traders, but we're very pro manifold markets here. They have a bet on whether or not nuclear weapons will be used in the Ukraine-Russia conflict. That bet is currently priced at 5%. I think it's timestamped to the end of the year. So 5% chance that a nuclear weapon is used by the end of the year. We are juxtaposing this against a bet over at Insight Prediction about whether or not the war will be over before the end of the year. So 8% chance. So I guess the question we're asking you is, if you were going to stake a little bit of a claim on this, would you bet on nuclear weapons before the end of the year or war over before the end of the year?
I'd bet on Russia dragging it out through the end of the year because they certainly want. There's an old expression that Russia's greatest commander has been General Winter. And, if there's a cold spell in Europe, would the Russians prefer to subject Europe to energy shortages and civil unrest and then say, well, let's negotiate? I think at that point, Germany will be ready to go. And, a lot of other people in Europe will certainly be possibly ready to negotiate once there's a lot of civil unrest. On the other hand, the German defense minister said about 2 weeks ago she really doesn't care what German voters think. And, Ursula von der Leyen has also been pretty dismissive of, popular sentiment. So that it may take.
Who's the authoritarian now? Westerners.
Yeah, it's true. And
a side note, I don't actually believe Putin and the German government are the same, but, let's make a joke.
Well, they did have a peace treaty once, but I think it may be if Russia can basically hold the line, keep losses at an acceptable level, and just drag this out through the winter, you may see enough unrest in Europe that may force the politicians' hand to actually negotiate. And that may be better for at least there'll never be the opprobrium on Russia that you guys escalated to the use of weapons of mass destruction if the Russians can rely on the winter doing the job for them.
The turnip winter returns in Germany, huh?
Yes.
A question.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
They'll be burning firewood again in Germany.
A question that's kind of related to the mapping out the timing of the war obviously has to do with whether or not Putin can remain in power. Now, I've been surprised by how high the betting markets are trading on predicted. For example, the markets are saying that Putin may be out of power by the end of the year. The odds there are 15% that he'll be out. Um, how secure do you think the Putin regime is, and how long do you think he can stay in power now with the mobilization, the setbacks in the war, the Russian economy tanking, and all that?
Well, I think the point's going to be not just will Putin stay in power, but who's coming after Putin. And the U.S. has not been particularly good at figuring out the who next, issue in terms of, say, Iraq and Afghanistan. So I think he'll probably hold on as long as, he gets through the immediate crisis of the mobilization. And if they can hold the line, keep losses at a low level, and then count on politics in Europe, helping him over the finish line. And I think what he really wants, he'd like to be victorious, obviously, but I think the process of sitting down across the table from, Ursula and Joe Biden would be much better, because that would show them meeting him as a peer and negotiating an end to the conflict. Now, Biden always said we're not going to do anything about Ukraine without Ukraine, and I'm sure he wouldn't mind meeting Zelensky too, and just to negotiate an end to it. And I think it would certainly look better for him as a statesman to have negotiated an end to the war rather than just blowing up all of Ukraine, which is going to. You're still going to have the potential for an insurgency, as some ex-CIA guys have been talking about, but that's just going to keep Europe disrupted for even longer. So I think he'd rather get a negotiated settlement that recognizes Russia's position and his position as a peer of the U.S. and the EU.
So one thing that you've been talking about, you were saying that it plays into Russia's hands in the short term for winter to occur in a war zone, for gas prices to go up, for kind of weak hands to shake out on the European continent. So there's a completely contrary perspective that, and I think ultimately we'll find that they make sense when you put them together, which is a lot of Western commentators are saying that Russia can't afford this war. The longer that it goes on, the more it dooms the Russian Empire or whatever remains of it. So, what is that sort of curve of time versus how long each side can fight? Is that a real thing?
Well, I think the U.S. can probably fight indefinitely if it's ready to run down its stocks of weaponry, and it's already started to bite into some of the inventory that's put aside for use of U.S. forces. So the U.S. and Europe may feel they've got time is on their side, and that may be true. But then when we work in the potential for unrest in Europe, which Russia will be sure to exploit, are we going to see? Well, we would look at it as a weakening of resolve. I think the Russians and some Europeans would see it as common sense prevailing. And the one thing that the U.S. gets wrong is we always misjudge people's will to fight, because we've never been at risk as a country ever. Well, since the Revolutionary War. So, we thought that
That's interesting, because every day the Washington Post says our democracy's at risk, and anyway, I just keep reading that in the paper.
Well, they keep repeating it, So, I think that, you may find, I'm sure a lot of these Russian young men that are signing up, I'm sure they know as well as anybody how good idea. They may think this has been a lousy idea, but we need to fight for our country. Mm-hmm. And so, you may find a lot of that. And so, but I think the U.S. probably has more time on its side if it's willing to keep this up. I'm not sure Europe feels it has time on its side, because it's going to suffer the economic effects of the sanctions. Well, they have been suffering those effects quite directly. And then they're going to have to deal with the weather effect. I mean, we could have a cold winter here and probably everybody will be all right. Yeah. In Europe, that's not quite the case.
Yeah.
I mean, there was a story a few weeks ago that on Google, searches in German for how do you find firewood have actually gone up. Now, I don't know if that's true. I saw it on Twitter, but so you have to take that with a grain of salt. But I think the U.S. can basically has a lot of running room left. Europe may not, and Russia may feel it doesn't have it either.
Yeah, in the U.S., you can always just drive to Arizona and squat on some federal land and stay warm for the winter.
There you go.
There's another question buried in this that we didn't really intend to address in this segment, but I guess we should. So, pretty high volume betting market exists on whether or not NATO will formally expand by the end of the year. Now, I know that there are some issues. They may or not be in your bailiwick, but do you think that the Sweden-Finland train is going to get disrupted over this issue with Turkey? Like, do you think that Joe Biden and the big dogs can kind of like iron over these issues within the NATO alliance, or are these kind of like longer problems that are just going to take a while?
Well, the Turkish parliament still has to vote on
Right.
Finland and Sweden joining. Erdogan said, okay, move ahead with the process, but his party controls the parliament, so they can still at the last minute say, we're not so sure.
Yeah.
And I don't think, Russia's concerns are not in Finland or Sweden. Their concern is basically that flat area of plain bordering Ukraine.
Right.
And I don't think they feel there's going to be an invasion through Finland or any of that stuff. It's just they want to secure that border, and they want to set up that buffer. They always want to have a good buffer zone, and NATO pushing up against their border meant the buffer zone went away. So I think we'll see Turkey probably try to exploit the expansion issue for all it's worth in true Erdogan style. And he's probably going to offer to host peace talks again between Russia and Ukraine, and this would be certainly a way for him to bolster his standing in the world and his personal standing also.
Well, but do you get the sense in your reporting, like I guess more from the DC Foggy Bottom Pentagon side, that this is an urgent issue in the Biden administration, or do you get the sense that it's just something that's going to get worked out on its own timeline?
Well, I think expanding NATO probably got a push from obviously the Russia-Ukraine war.
Yeah.
But again, it gets down to Erdogan putting it up for a vote in front of the Turkish parliament. And if he doesn't think it's not a priority, then he may need to be incentivized to make it a priority. And, what are we going to do? I mean, I'm sure we'll do the time-honored way of threatening him, but, what's in it for him?
Got it.
And he already said the other day that if Congress doesn't approve the block of, I guess, the latest sale of F-16s, he may get a little closer to Russia. So
well, maybe Ron DeSantis will send some, airplanes full of migrants to Turkey and offer the carrot and the stick.
They got enough migrant problems to deal with right now. They have all those Syrians.
That's right.
That's
right.
Many of whom are actually settling down in southern Turkey. So it could be interesting to see what effect that has long term.
Yeah. Well, great weather there too, so never know.
Very nice.
Well, before we close out, Jim, I did want to just ask you about these wild rumors that have been circulating about a possible coup in China. And I guess the impetus for this is whether or not Xi Jinping, the general secretary in China, will get reelected. The markets on Predicted are saying only 82% chance that he will get reelected. But I mean, what's going on there, broadly speaking?
I wish Joe Biden probably wishes he had those numbers, but there was, I guess, some video out a few days ago on TikTok or Twitter or one of them that there was a column of military vehicles driving down a road near Beijing, and that quickly became Xi Jinping is under house arrest. He probably wouldn't have left the country to go to the SCO summit in Uzbekistan, and he went to a meeting in Kazakhstan a couple days before, unless he felt the situation was secure. And apparently Hu Jintao, his predecessor, was involved in this somehow. So it would be pretty unusual for a former Chinese leader to come out of retirement and sponsor, I guess, a coup against the current leader. So I don't know. It may just be something internal, him resolving some issue with some opponents of his. I don't know. I mean, it doesn't look good in terms of, he's supposed to be going into this party meeting, with the wind at his back. So what exactly calling up the military doesn't particularly look good. Either if things are going just fine, why do you need the military in downtown Beijing? And if things are going badly, now we know why there's the militaries in downtown Beijing. So it doesn't look good, but we won't know for some time what the real reason is. But it looks worrying that, there's some some dispute going on within the upper leadership of the Chinese Communist Party.
Well, Chris
And
Tucker,
involved.
I don't know if you guys remember, but Chris Tucker and Jackie Chan defeated Jintao pretty easily in the 90s in that movie Rush. What was it called? Rush Hour. So
Rush Hour, yeah.
Sounds like a paper tiger to me. How is it possible that we have no idea what's going on in China? That's like allegedly the second largest economy and some people say the most influential country in the world now. How do we not know what's going on there? That's bonkers.
Well, our on-the-ground intelligence is probably pretty limited because the Chinese Ministry of State Security is pretty competent and it's pretty big.
Yeah.
And, I'm sure that all our CIA case officers at the embassy are probably pretty quickly known to Chinese intelligence. And their movements are going to be probably a little prescribed. And again, how good is our technical means, our National Security Agency and our photo means to realize what's going on? I'm sure the Chinese know we're trying to elicit in, so they may very cunningly only meet face to face.
Yeah.
Or the most sensitive stuff is never shared over a phone line or electronically.
But, I mean, aren't there like 1 billion people in China? Like, don't they have loose lips?
Well, I mean, the Chinese regime follows certainly the online tweeting and social media posting of the Chinese people. So it probably has a fairly good idea of public sentiment. Yeah. I mean, they're not oblivious to what your average Chinese guy thinks. Whether that matters is another issue at all. But they may be, but again, do they know even any better than some CIA guy at Langley knows?
Right.
I mean, just because they live in China doesn't mean they know more than about what's going on. In fact, they may know less. Yeah. So you would think NSA would be able to dial into Xi Jinping's mobile phone, though he probably doesn't have one, and find out what's going on. But at that level, those guys probably don't get on the phone and talk about stuff.
I would settle for just like a cops show, like that awesome show that's been on TV for 30 years, but like in Shanghai. Like, I just want to know what people are getting arrested for, and if they're on drugs or rednecks or fighting gators or whatever it is. I feel like we could learn a lot about China if they just had that TV show there.
Yeah, that's probably true. But I think that at the upper level of Chinese politics, you've got a lot of pretty disciplined operators.
Yeah.
And I think they know to get on the phone, first, their own side is going to hear them because I'm sure they know they're all being watched, and the Americans are going to hear them. And so unless you want the Americans to hear you, it's probably best to just stay off the phone and just conduct everything in a face-to-face manner rather than committing it to electrons, which basically makes it then interceptable. So, I mean, and again, I just saw something the other day that said we have a big shortage of Chinese speakers, which certainly hurts us in terms of intelligence collection, not just in terms of human intelligence in Beijing, but in terms of, analysts listening to, intercepts. I'm sure we're vacuuming up a lot of signals intelligence from China. It's just, what do we do with it once we get it?
Sounds like a job for some robots.
Well, probably so. And I'm sure Booz Allen is working on that.
Yeah.
But, can we decrypt and read and interpret and write up in time for our policymakers to make a decision based on all that stuff we intercept? We may not have the assets to do it quickly enough to matter.
Pratik, you want to take us the last mile here?
No, that was good. I mean, I guess maybe a final question. Do you have any thoughts or predictions on American politics, whether or not Joe Biden's going to, I guess, outlast some of these world leaders we've talked about?
I don't know. I mean, I read something the other day. There was a poll that only 35% of Democrats want him to run again. So he may not outlast 2024. Whether he'll outlast Putin, I don't know. Or Xi Jinping, again, I don't know.
Well, let me close out with a better question. I mean, more in the foreign affairs realm. I mean, I know you follow, quite a bit about international politics. What's like, if you were to say one crisis or issue out there that no one's paying attention to that could surprise us in the coming months, what should we be looking out for?
Probably, Afghanistan. What's going to be happening there, or Iran? Actually, let me back that up. Iran. You've certainly got a lot of protests right now about that activist that was allegedly killed. you've got a lot of Iranian protesters turning up in just about every major city. Now, a lot of the people that work with the government have said, well, why are these quote unquote peaceful protesters rioting and burning? And so to some degree, we may find the MEK is behind a lot of the, the activism we see. But that's certainly one issue we need to be concerned about, because, what is the Iranian regime going to do if they feel that, there's a threat to the stability of the regime? And they may feel there's a Western hand and all that. Even if there isn't, they're going to think that there is, and they're going to say that there is. But I think Iran is probably because if Iran becomes unstable, that's certainly going to destabilize Central and South Asia. And we've been hoping that the Central Asian states, like Uzbekistan, can help stabilize Afghanistan. But if everything goes down the drain on Afghanistan's western border, that's certainly going to spill over and certainly affect Central and South Asia.
Right. So like if the peaceful protests that we had in like I remember the peaceful protests in the United States, the building across me got burned down, my building got broken into. It sounds like there's some peaceful protests like that happening in Iran, and maybe that chaos might cause some more peaceful protests of buildings being burned down and broken into.
The Minneapolis model of peaceful protesting.
Got it.
Yeah, I Jake Sullivan was on the Sunday shows this past weekend, and I was quite surprised he got a question, I think from Chuck Todd or something. He basically to the effect that, well, under the Obama administration, you guys didn't do all that much to aid the Iranian supporters. Are you going to take a different tack? And I thought for sure Jake would more or less dodge the question, and he answered it up straight up. He basically said, "Look, we miscalculated under Obama. We thought that the best thing would be to just not avoid the perception of U.S. involvement." But he more or less made it clear that the administration is going to do what it can to support these uprisings.
And just late last week, the U.S. approved the general license to export, I guess, Elon Musk's Starlink equipment to Iran. Now, how it gets into Iran is going to be another issue. But, if any of them turn up in Iran, the U.S. government's not going to have any complaints about that. So that's one step the U.S. has taken that's probably non-kinetic, that it will probably use to try to disrupt the regime. But again, it's how determined are the regime guys going to be to staying in power? And they've got a lot of supporters. It's not just them. It's the army, the Revolutionary Guard, the Basij militia, and a lot of the people that work for the state-owned enterprises, because the Iranian government controls a large chunk of the economy. And are they going to get those folks mobilized also? So,
wow,
that remains to be seen.
Sounds like we're going to have to rebrand Regime Change. So, looking forward to that podcast.
It's called Democracy. It's called Democracy Promotion.
That's right. That's soft power. We're pro soft power podcast, pro American podcast, anti authoritarian regimes burning people and ruining their lives podcast. We're just the good guys here, and we're really glad that. Jokes aside, Jim, we're really glad you can join. As you can probably tell, foreign policy is not my personal métier. I probably should have let Pratik do the talking on this podcast. I'm sorry, Pratik, for negging you a little bit and doing all the talking. But we're really thankful, and so are our users, that we now can count you as a resource who can come tell us what's actually going on in some of these scenarios that we are talking about. So I will say goodbye and thank you on that. Pratik, I'll let you do the rest of the talking because I need to just shut up.
Yeah, no, Jim, why don't you tell our audience where we can find you, your work? I know you write a column for The Hill, but anywhere else would be great.
Also, I stuff in defense.info and oilprice.com.
All right.
Or just Google me. And I'm on Twitter, but that's about as far as my social media exposure allows.
All right. Jim Durso, he says, Google me, bitch. All right. Thanks for joining us, Jim. We'll see you next time.
Thank you very much. Bye, guys.